All right, well, thank you so much all for coming. For those who don't know me, my name is Hisham, and I woke up and came here this morning just to let everybody know that we got Paul Pierson in the house. We're so excited to welcome him here at our CDDL seminar titled Assessing the Risks of Democratic Backsliding in the US. The vast majority of you, if not all, every single one of you, know who Paul is. He is the John Gross Distinguished Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Berkeley. He is a social scientist whose work has shaped how our field studies political institutions and how we use historical analysis to understand the origins of social phenomena. Paul's path-breaking contributions have also left an enduring impact on our understanding of the evolution of welfare states and social policies. And finally, he's a scholar who today is devoting all his knowledge, expertise, rigor, and intellectual energies to the service of understanding the challenges and problems that are continuing to confront our troubled democracy here in the United States, which is the topic of today's discussion. He's published over 200 articles and several books that collected awards, honors, and recognitions that I'm not going to name because in the interest of time, and that continue to occupy a prominent space in graduate training in the social sciences. And among the books that he's published are, of course, the classics. You all know The Dismantling of the Welfare State, Politics and Time. They also include the hard-hitting books, more recent books about the state of American democracy, like Let Them Eat Tweets, I love that title, and Winner Takes All Politics with Jacob Hacker, and most recently, Partisan Nation with Eric Schickler, and that will be informing today's talk, at least in part. He is a former Guggenheim Fellow and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. His recent honors, many honors, I should say, include election to the American Academy of Political and Social Sciences as the 2022 Robert Dahl Fellow. Paul, it's an honor to be in your company. Thank you for joining us. Paul will speak for about 35 minutes to 40 minutes or so. If you have any questions, please hold on to them tight until we get to the Q&A part, and then we'll try to get as many of your questions as we can. Paul, it's all you. Thank you.
Wow, Hashem, thank you so much. That was super kind, and I have to pull back on one piece of that praise, because if I've written 200 articles, at least 100 of them were written by ChatGPT. I don't think I've quite reached that level yet.
That's what all the scholars said. So
yeah, really, well, yes. Well, they're giving me credit for things that I don't deserve credit. But anyway, I really appreciate that. Great to be with you. Great to be with a bunch of. I used to say old friends. Now I say longtime friends, because I don't want my old friends to feel like I'm picking on them. And I do feel a little bit, it feels a little bit like a cold to Newcastle moment to come and talk with this group about the erosion of democracy. I know a lot of people in this room have been thinking about that for a lot longer than I have, and have studied a lot of cases that I don't know much about. I stumbled into this topic because of the way that the United States is stumbling, and so I feel like I have an enormous amount to learn. So I'll try to move through this reasonably quickly. I'm not always good at that, but I want to make sure that there's a lot of time for discussion. And I owe apologies in particular to Hakeem and to Frank, both of whom have commented on the Partisan Nation book at previous events. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I promise it's only like the first chunk of the talk. We'll get on to some things that you at least have not heard from me. You may have heard them from other people. So talking about democratic backsliding in the United States, and I've got my own slides here just so I don't have to like constantly turn around. But I just want to start, I think for somebody who now, I started out as a comparativist, started out studying comparative politics, sort of meandered into studying American politics in part because I felt like there were great arbitrage opportunities, that there were a lot of things that comparativists knew that Americanists didn't know, and it was, rather than coming up with new ideas, I could just do arbitrage. But I think Americanists, now that's my home island, really are having a challenging time trying to get their heads around what's happening in the United States. That's partly because it's like a really hard thing to study when it's happening. Hard thing to study when it's happening because a lot of it is not very visible. A hard thing to study when it's happening because we're in this kind of game theoretical land in many cases where everybody is updating their expectations. I don't know if anybody's seen the three-body problem, but I think of this as we're living in an unstable era. Right? That's a sci-fi set of novels, Chinese novels, right, in which there's a planet becomes threatening to the United States because their own planet is subject to unstable eras that are totally devastating. And so we're in this unstable era where we don't know how expectations are going to shift. That's going to matter a lot. I think, elite expectations in various sites in American politics are going to matter a lot. These things are non-linear, I think, so you have to think about it. All of this is very hard to do in real time. Very, very hard for Americanists, so those within political science in the United States who study the United States, very hard for Americans to think about these kinds of issues. I mean, I think it's a real failure of the subfield that is simply was designed for a world that I don't think really exists anymore, or at least is under fundamental challenge at the very minimum. I don't want to get, we could talk about this if people are interested. There's an interesting sociology of knowledge here, I think, about how the American field developed as this like separate island that was totally cut off from the study of comparative politics. I think there is a normative underpinning to the way that a lot of Americans study American politics. They wouldn't admit to that, right? They think that they're like the most scientific of political scientists, but I think many of them are at least implicitly deeply committed to the idea that voters call the shots in American politics. And so they have very elaborate, in many ways, quite useful models about how that works, but I think it makes it hard for them to focus on other kinds of political dynamics. And those are not ones that exclude voters. Voters continue to be important players, right? But there are a lot of other players that really matter. There are a lot of other critical dynamics going on that are, I think, for which the kind of main working models in the American politics field are not well designed. Just one example, like we don't know anything about how the military works. Right, and how that might change and the implications of that for domestic politics. Right, so if you're a comparativist, would think a lot about something like that. Americanists would not even recognize that as a significant subject for investigation. And that's just one example, but that's a big liability, I think, when you start needing to think about democratic backsliding, which we do. Right. I don't need to say anything more about this. I think at this point, this is just like the first 24 hours, a slide that I put up when I talked about this stuff in Paris a few months ago. We could spend this seminar and many seminars more just listing some of the things that are going on, right, that make this an important issue to be thinking about. That's the slide that I showed in Paris, just things that happened in the first 24 hours, and it feels like every 24 hours since then, there are at least 3 or 4 more bullet points that one could put up on a slide. Now, I think it's fair to say, the reason to say, like, if you were looking at this, if you're going back and thinking about this 10 years ago and saying, well, how vulnerable is the U.S. to democratic backsliding? Not a question that Americans would have asked. They would have said, and I think most comparatives would have said, not very vulnerable. Right. What do we know? We know that the 2 best predictors of democratic stability are how long have you been a democracy, right, and how rich are you? Right? Now, complicated question, how long the United States has been a democracy. Right? Really good argument to say since 1965. Right? People could argue other things, but I think by the standards of the literature, right, the comparative literature, usually we say, like, it's been a democracy. It's had democratic institutions that are core to how it works for a long time. Obviously, a very rich country, and so you would think this system ought to be pretty stable. Right? Shouldn't be very vulnerable. And yet we know that it looks very fragile, at best, very, very fragile. And so what I want to suggest is kind of the focus, and I'm not going to give like a full account of what I think is going on. I don't feel ready to try to do that, but I want to explore 2 aspects of it that I think are crucial components for trying to understand what has been happening, what is happening. And I think kind of the punchline that I would like to start with is that I don't think that right-wing populism in the US is particularly popular, like is in comparative terms. I don't think it's actually any more, like if you think about like what the MAGA core is, there's like a MAGA core in a lot of countries, a lot of affluent democracies, 30%, something like that. So it's not unusually popular. I mean, that's a big number, right? And it's having big effects on politics of a lot of countries, but it's not producing the same kind of democratic backsliding in a lot of those countries, at least not yet. So what I want to suggest is that it's not that right-wing populism is especially popular in the United States, but it is unusually powerful. And I'm going to take basically two cuts on that, and I don't have a nice way of tying these two things together yet. There's two things that I'm thinking about, which draw on the kind of work that I've been doing both with Eric Schickler and Jacob Hacker, and I should say, their thinking has so much gotten into my thinking that they are like fully anything that's muddled or inadequate in what I'm saying, they are fully accountable. It's almost certainly an idea that came from Eric and Jacob, so you should hold them accountable for it. But I basically want to sketch out two aspects of this. One is an institutional story, and the other is a political economy story. Right? And again, I don't yet have a great way of thinking about how to tie these two stories together, but I think they're both important. So the story about the Constitution that I want to talk about has two components that I'm really only going to talk about one, which is the one that Eric and I focus on in our book, which is the breakdown of a kind of what we call a kind of Madisonian system. You can put an asterisk on Madisonian because all the complexities of Madison didn't actually design the system. Nobody designed the system that we have. Madison had a lot of other ideas about what he wanted. But Federalist 10 and Federalist 51, I think, does capture the core of a lot of ways that we've expected our institutions to function. And we argue in the book the way the institutions actually did function, right? Up until, I don't know, put a date on it, post-civil rights era. Right? It's when the system starts to break down. So we're going to talk about the breakdown of the Madisonian system. The other institutional point, which I'm not going to pursue here today, but I do think is really important. I think Americans really underestimate how profound the impact is of the fact that we have a two-party system, like a hard two-party system, right? Which is very unusual compared. And what that has allowed is essentially, if a party you have a kind of half of a half strategy, right? If you can dominate in primaries and capture a party, and you can hold that party together, right? For reasons that we could talk about, or some reasons that I'm going to talk about, you're going to hold it together. Then you can get from 30% to 50, something like 50%. Okay? So that's part. I do think just that fact that we have institutional arrangements that really incentivize a strong two-party system is important. But I'm not going to say more about that. Now I'm going to talk about the second thing, and then in the political economy part, I'm going to talk about the role of inequality, high-end inequality, what Jacob and I have called plutocratic populism, and the transition that we have been making over the last few years from what I'm going to call plutocratic populism 1.0 and 2.0. Right? Okay, so those are the two takes that I'm going to try to, and I'm going to move right to this institutional argument first. Okay, so this is the argument that Eric and I make in this book that was published last year. See if I can, get this one. Oh, I need to do it this way. I got two clickers going, so that's kind of a problem. All right, so what we suggest is this Madisonian system, again, I'm going to call it a Madisonian system, did have very powerful effects on the way that American politics work. And the book includes a historical investigation that looks at earlier rounds of polarization in American politics. If you listen to the Hamilton musical, I say to my undergraduates, it's not very successfully, this is a musical about partisan polarization, right? That's what this is about. And in a way, it is about that, right? It's about the really rapid development of these two teams that really hate each other and see the other side as a threat. Then, of course, you have the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, right? And the period around the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, which is, based on the kind of measures that we tend to use to measure at least polarization in Congress, also a period of really high polarization. We look at all those periods in the book, and while acknowledging that they were periods of high polarization, the basic argument that we make is that core Madisonian institutions eat away at that polarization over time. It doesn't harden, right? It doesn't become a permanent single cleavage, partly because you have this radical dispersion of political authority, new stats lines, separate institutions sharing power, reinforced by a robust and decentralized federalism. Federalism is really important. If any of you have read Eric Schickler's fantastic racial realignment book, he argues that a critical component of the big rupture in American politics that happens in the 1960s is that it grows in part out of federalism, where the Democratic Party at the state and local level, right, has very different incentives than the Democratic Party nationally, which is trying to hold this New Deal coalition, which includes white oligarchs in the South, right? That makes a lot of sense for the national politicians. It doesn't make sense for the local politicians in the North, increasingly over time. And eventually that makes the attempt to paper over those differences, no longer viable for the Democratic Party. Right? So dispersion of authority, pluralism generating representation, right? So you're elected from a particular place, right? And for varying lengths of terms. All of this leading to where you stand depends on where you sit, right? And where you're from, right? In American politics. So in the words of 51, and picking up on this first point, ambition is made to counter ambition. And Federalist 10, again, it's a story about how the extended republic, this kind of diversity, is going to generate lots of overlapping and fluid factions. So oversimplification, right, to say that this in any way summarizes the American political system, but we say that we show in the book, I think, that it does capture a lot of how it works, and in particular, why it makes it hard over time to sustain a sort of red versus blue world. Nelson Polsby, I'm trying to get, right, I'm still working on my two clickers simultaneously. Nelson Polsby called this a 100-party system. It's an exaggeration, but I think it does suggest that for a long time, career paths ran through the states, the parties were weak and heterogeneous, and pulling back to comparative, Juan Lintz's famous work on presidentialism, right, and the vulnerability of presidential systems to democratic breakdown. This was his answer to why the U.S. was an exception, right? You didn't get this kind of parliament versus Congress versus the president kind of world, because the parties were so weak, so heterogeneous internally, that instead you had this world of like shifting, overlapping coalitions, rather than the kind of polarization that could lead to breakdown. Okay. So part of the motivation for Eric and I in writing this book was that we felt like people were starting to make this argument, both in political science and in some kinds of punditry, of saying like, that period from, I don't know, the 1940s to the 1970s, when you had a lot of bipartisanship, that was actually the exceptional era. Like the normal thing in American politics is for the parties to be polarized, right? And so they could point to some of this roll call data, for example, in support of that. But I think, we argue strongly in the book what was going on in that period up to, say, the 1970s in this decentralized Madisonian system looks very different, right? So than the system that we have now. So saying we used to be polarized, right? And not have these big problems, except for that, slight those uncomfortable episodes in the 1860s. But we got through these other episodes of polarization. That's actually not that helpful for thinking about contemporary politics, because the world we're in now is really different. Politics, I'm going to go through this all very quickly. We could come back to it. Politics is nationalized. We put a lot of emphasis in the book on how the way that institutions function, the way the political order functions, it's not just like a voter-politician dyad relationship, but intermediary institutions are really critical. Media, interest groups, state parties, and whether they really are like distinct, separate parties, and like the key to professional and the professional development paths for ambitious politicians, right? All of this really matters. And basically over the last 50 years or so, coming out of the realignment, the racial realignment of the political parties, and also coming out of the massive expansion of the role of the federal government, right, in American society, has gradually led to all of these things nationalizing, and increasingly these mediating institutions, rather than breaking down polarization, actually serving to intensify it. Again, we could talk about that more if people want to. So now you get a world of teamsmanship, a world of what Linson Steffen called semi-loyalists, right? So people are really attached to their team, maybe attached to their team, even if that means being attached to an authoritarian. So Levitsky and Ziblatt in their book last year, many of the politicians who preside over democracy's collapse are just ambitious careerists. They don't oppose democracy out of deep-seated principle, but are merely indifferent to it. They tolerate or condone anti-democratic extremism because it's the path of least resistance. Ultimately, they become indispensable partners in democracy's demise. In the system that we have now, it's much more fruitful terrain for the development of semi-loyalists in various kinds of contexts. Ambition doesn't counter ambition anymore. And to shift quickly to the language that introduces, right, that we can think of the protections of democracy as involving horizontal accountability and vertical accountability. Vertical accountability means voters are a check on politicians who might become authoritarian. Horizontal accountability is basically the idea of separation of powers, of checks and balances. But when polarization is high and nationalized, the system of horizontal accountability breaks down. And we can talk about this more again, but I would just say, like, I think it is actually at this point inconceivable that any set of actions on the part of President Trump could lead the Republican majority in Congress to challenge him because he was behaving in a way that was anti-democratic. I just think it's, I mean, maybe if his popularity collapsed, we could talk about that, right? But at this moment, I think it's pretty clear that, like, nothing that he could do would have that effect. And that's a big change from, say, 1973, 1974, when Richard Nixon, right, fresh off of a landslide electoral victory, which of course Donald Trump did not win, right, nonetheless behaved in ways that eventually produced really dramatic and ultimately, for him, politically fatal pushback from members of his own political party. We do not live in that kind of world. Okay, there's much more to be said about this, but I want to keep moving forward because I want to make sure that we have time. To have some discussion. I guess maybe I'll just say one thing at this point, in addition to this slide, is that one of the arguments that Eric and I make in the book is that the breakdown of horizontal accountability also breaks down vertical accountability. Right? That is, it makes it harder for voters to play a potential role as a check on authoritarian impulses coming out of the executive. And that is because one of the things that allows voters to play that role is that they're getting some signals from elites that allow them to see that something is going seriously wrong. Right? And so it was very important, if one thinks about the fall of Nixon, like, you can look at what happened in approval polls, which is, of course, Republicans always supported him more than Democrats did, or more than independents did. But it wasn't as if his support just went way down among Democrats. It went way down among Republicans, too. And a big part of that was because some Republican politicians pretty early on stood up and started saying, like, yeah, this is a serious thing. Like, this is really problematic. And that produces a kind of informational feedback loop, right, where politicians say that makes voters, including Republican voters, more open to the idea, right, that something's wrong, that they really need to look at. And as their views start to change, it then becomes easier for Republican elites to think, maybe we need to detach ourselves from this leader. And more people jump off the ship. That creates a stronger signal that something is wrong. You can see how that would work. That is not the world that we live in now. we live in a bend the knee world, right? And I do think Donald Trump, one of his great talents, right, has been to reorganize, first within the Republican Party and now increasingly beyond the Republican Party, kind of bend the knee policy. If you haven't watched Game of Thrones, like that's all they talk about in Game of Thrones, right? He didn't bend the knee. She bent the knee. Why won't he bend the knee? Like, everything would be okay if you would just bend the knee, right? But you have to pick what side you're on, right? So again, this is part of where the semi-loyalism plays. You start to move in to a politics in which people line up on one side, including with the potential authoritarian. Okay, I already talked about this. Lack of horizontal accountability, minus a vertical accountability. We shouldn't think of these as completely separate processes, right, or mechanisms that put limits on democratic backsliding. They're actually quite interdependent, right? So if there's a breakdown of horizontal accountability, that's going to be a problem for vertical accountability as well. Okay, so that's very quick version. Read the book, read Partisan Nation. You'll see more about this. I think this institutional analysis holds up quite well. Sadly, I really wish it didn't, but I think it holds up quite well. And as we watch, I think there are interesting questions. We could talk about the courts, where I think things are a little like, I think the degree of teamsmanship is maybe a little bit more limited in the courts, and that could turn out to be really important. But in Congress, I think it's just really striking to see the system not function at all the way that Madison 51 said that it would function, where Congress is just handing everything over to the president. Okay. Want to shift gears and talk quickly. How am I doing on time? I'm sure.
Like 15 minutes.
Okay, that's not bad. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about this political economy piece and talk about very quickly about a couple of books that I already wrote with Jacob, but say a little bit. And again, this is less well developed than because Partisan Nation, we spent a lot of time thinking about this institutional arguments. But I do think we really want to think about kind of what the political economy piece is of what's going on in the United States. So I've been thinking for a long time with Jacob about rising inequality. The U.S. is a huge outlier among rich democracies in the concentration of income and wealth. And that has gotten much, so people talk about rising inequality in lots of democracies. True, right? But the differences between what's happened in most other countries where there's been like a modest rise of inequality and maybe a modest growth of top 10% shares or top 1% shares is not the same as what's happened in the US, where it's like, Occupy Wall Street said, we are the 99%. They should have said like, we're the 99.99% or 999%, right? To really get at how concentrated the gains have been. We made this argument in 2010. It is so much more true now than it was when we wrote this book in 2010, right? The amount of wealth at the top, right, is so much greater than it was then. The ability to translate that wealth into political activity is much greater than it was in 2010, right? So this topic really, I think, really deserves to be revisited. And as I start to get into this, I should also do a shout out to Adam Bonica. You're going to see like a bunch of the slides here are Bonica's slides because I think he's doing the best job of anybody out there right now, really thinking about tracking some of these developments. So thank you, Adam. Okay, let them be tweets. There's some more recent ones. Sorry, I wanted to just find a slide of the book, but I ran out of time, so you get to see our faces. So this was an argument about plutocratic populism 1.0, right? In which we argued that there was. So Paul Ryan said this, that he said we have a coalition, right, without a parliamentary system. And by the coalition, he meant like the Republican corporate, wealthy, oligarchic establishment and the kind of populist forces that Donald Trump was defending, right? Coalition. And so what we argue in the book is drawing apart on Daniel Ziblatt's work on conservative historical work on conservative parties, one incredible book if you haven't read it, right? In which he talks about the conservative dilemma. Like if you're a conservative party, traditionally organized, historically organized around economic elites, and now you confront the emerging reality of a mass electorate, and you have to figure out how to appeal to that mass electorate, you face a big challenge, right? And it's actually really hard. Like you can start moving in a more kind of centrist pro-welfare state direction. That can help a little bit, but you're competing with parties further to your left who are probably going to try to outbid you on a lot of that kind of stuff. Ziblatt and other people have made this argument as well. And Gibson's made this argument about Latin America. Conservative parties are likely to try to push through second dimension issues, right? They want to get people thinking about religion or race or nationalism. Because they're on stronger terrain if they can make that an important part of politics. And Ziblatt's argument is that can get out of control, like if you do that. And so the contrast is between the German Conservative Party and the British Conservative Party, where the British are able to kind of manage that process, and in Germany it gets badly out of control as you kind of like whip up these extreme right sentiments. So we were interested in applying these ideas to thinking about the United States in the context of rapidly rising inequality and what that does to the Republican Party in particular. And I won't say more about that now. I just want to give you just a little bit of data on some trend lines so you can see government spending has been going up pretty rapidly. I lost a piece of the slide. It would have shown the last few elections. It's really jumped up. This is a pretty stunning slide that shows, the percentage. Okay, so we wrote Winner Take All Politics in 2010, right, where the top 1%, 1/100th of 1% was giving about 30% of all federal campaign contributions. It's now up to about 50%. Oh yeah, I'm not supposed to touch this screen. And that's cool. That's cool that does that, but I was not expecting it. So the share just coming from the top, I can't remember, it's like something like 15,000 donors or 20,000 donors or something like that. But that 30% share now comes from about the top 400 donors. Just a little bit more, right? And that 1/100th of 1% is giving almost half of federal campaign contributions, right? It's just like people don't know this, right? But it's a big deal. And the other piece of the story that I just want to bring in is the gains in wealth, right, of the people at the very top are just staggering, right? So start at the bottom here. If you look at the Forbes 400 list in 1983, and this is all controlling for inflation, there's not an inflation story, right? In 1983, the very top of the Forbes 400 list was Gordon Getty with a fortune of about $6 billion. Okay. Musk's current this was actually done in January. I don't know exactly where Tesla stock is today. I think it's probably, his total is low. I don't know, he's somewhere in the 300s probably today. It went down, but it's been going back up. But just the gain that he had in a single year last year, right, was 30 times. Right, the total fortune of the richest guy on the Fortune 400 list 40 years ago, right? And he wasn't alone. All these other people saw gains in their wealth last year between 60 and $80 billion. Right? There's just a ton of money, right, at the top, right? And it now translates into politics in a way that in a way that's it's a lot easier for that to happen now than used to be true. This is one of Adam's slides, and it shows, like, even if you look at this is 100 richest Americans, right, and the growth in their wealth in the past year in 2024. And there are two things to see here. So one, again, and this is the thing about studying top end inequality. It's like fractal. Like every time you go, like if you go in the top 1%, you see that most of the gains are in the top 10th of 1%. If you go in the top 10th, you see that most of the gains are in the top 10th of that. And you can just keep doing that. And so you can see here that the gains were really, it's like a handful of people, right? who had, just unbelievable gains in their fortune in the last year. Blue dot means it's tech related. It's a tech related company. Not surprising. Again, a kind of cold in Newcastle kind of moment to tell you guys about that. But there's a ton of money in Silicon Valley, and a ton more than there was a few years ago. Okay. Interesting slide here is just showing. So this is people who are giving more than $100,000 to one party or the other. And I just want, so huge growth, right? And how much money is coming? This isn't the number of people, this is the amount of money that they're getting totaled up. So what's the top line? They're $3 billion. And you can see the growth, the post-Citizens United growth, really staggering. But the other thing that I really wanted to highlight here is the difference between 2020 and 2024. The super wealthy, they did switch sides. They did switch sides, at least, and of course, Musk Musk alone is a big chunk of that, $300 million or something like that. But he's not the only one. So it's definitely a lot more widespread than that. Here is also a slide from Adam, right? So that shows breakdown of money that's coming from the Republican Party. And I'll just tell you, the Democratic Party actually looks really different. He's got a nice Substack post about this where he says basically Democrats should start saying we're not going to take this big money anymore. And he says like they could do it. They've got a financial model that would allow them to do that. But the amount of money that's coming from people who are giving over half the money going to the Republicans and like their allied big national groups, outside money groups, over half the money is coming from people who are giving at least $1 million. And really stunning. I think everybody realizes there's a lot of big money in politics, but I don't think people realize just how dramatic it is and how different it is between the political parties. And I'll just say like quick aside on this for thinking about political economy. So I'm involved in this project. Some of you have engaged with where we're trying to build a field of American political economy with where this should actually be something that needs to be done to actually have people who are interested in American politics studying political economy and really thinking of that as a core field the way it is in comparative or the way that it is in international relations, but it did need to be done. So I've been working with people on that for the last few years. And one thing that I've taken to saying in those meetings is like, we used to talk a lot about like business, like when we, and thought about like wealthy as just being kind of like a little bit of a sidecar to business. But I think we now live in a world pretty clearly where you need to think of the wealthy or the super wealthy as a distinct analytic category from big business, or corporations or something like that, right? And it's because it's the amount of money that people have and and sometimes that money is really tied to the particular economic interests of the area where that person made their fortune, or maybe they're still really embedded in that area, but it's not the same as corporate money. So I think that's something really important that needs to be studied. Okay, everybody's seen this slide, right? We're thinking for just a minute, like pretty weird, right? 5 of the 7 wealthiest men in the world, right, on the stage behind Donald Trump as inaugurated. 5 out of the top 7, including the richest 3. Bezos, I think, kind of looks like he ate a bad piece of sushi there, but but they're all up there, right? And so everybody, and with again, something that never would have happened in American politics before, right? That you would do that. Like people like that might be influencing the government in all sorts of important ways, but you would never parade them up there on stage like that. So how do we think about that? And one way to think about it is, we're being run by a oligarchy, right? That these people have taken over, and certainly a lot of the slides that I just showed you could feed into that kind of interpretation. There's just like so much money, and this is about them showing their power, flaunting their power. That was plutocratic populism 1.0. I think 2.0 is pretty different. And I should have left myself more time to talk about this than I did. But I think we're witnessing, might put Musk in his own category, right, subcategory, and thinking about his role. But I think when Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos are standing up there, they're mostly standing up there because they're afraid, right? They're bending the knee, right? And they have good reason to bend their knee in a context. And here is a place where we can like link back to the institutional argument I was making in the first part of the paper, right? So if President Trump now can stack agencies with not semi-loyalists, total loyalists, right? And not have to worry very much about checks coming from the other branches, certainly not from Congress, maybe not from the courts, right? And if he basically has a desire, right, to take the administrative state and turn it into a pay-to-play system, that concentrates enormous power, right? And enormous power that even these super wealthy people, right, are vulnerable to. Right? And we see this every day. We picked up the paper this morning, and they were talking about the trade negotiations going on with India, and what a profound effect that was going to have on Apple potentially, right? Which is trying to do more. And Trump is saying, like, I don't want you guys manufacturing in India. I want you guys manufacturing in the U.S. But that's just one of a very, very long list of examples we could give of where a coordinated, loyalist-based system of administrative action, right? And you talk about the SEC, the FCC, Department of Justice, the IRS, the FBI. It gets scarier as you move further along, right? But it can affect so many things about the lives of even these really powerful people. Right. So we've never seen a system like that. Right. We've never seen, I don't just mean like in the US, we've never seen a system that combined, like nobody would say that Russia is a oligarchy. Right. They're oligarchs, right? But the oligarchs are not the really powerful ones. I think, I don't know, other people know Russia more, you tell me more, but we think like Putin has power, right? And he can make or break people. Right. So we've seen that, right? But we haven't seen it in the richest country in the world, right? With the amazing companies that are within 10 miles of where we're sitting right now. Right? This is something new, and I don't think we yet. I'm not sure we're yet even asking the right questions about how to think about that kind of political economy. Super uncertain, right? Is not. I'm not saying this is like a fixed thing. I don't believe that. I think that things are actually enormously uncertain at the current time. But I think we should be thinking really seriously about how this kind of political economy potentially works. Okay, 3 quick reasons for skepticism about where we might be going. Trump's not particularly popular. His polls have actually rebounded a little bit in the last few weeks. Pendulums are real. Much of what he wants to do, much of what Congress seems well on their way to doing, is not going to be popular. I do think that matters, right? And that will have consequences. One way of thinking about the electoral politics of the last 20 years in the U.S. is that it is all backlash politics. Mm-hmm. Right? It's just like one story after another of somebody getting unified control and then getting crushed. Right? Unclear whether those dynamics still hold in the world that we're in now, but it's worth thinking. Certainly an argument that's worth taking seriously. Elements of what I might broadly call Madisonianism still exist. Right? We have it's a big, sprawling system with a lot of diffuse authority. Theda Skocpol gave her Madison lecture, I think, right? It was the Madison lecture she gave at APSA last year, in which she basically made a version of the argument that I'm making her here. I like to think of, and Ed Tufte likes to show this slide. This is his favorite data slide ever of Napoleon's invasion of Russia, right? And it's basically what happens to the French army as it's advancing, and then it starts really big, and by the time Russia's just a really big and really cold country, and by the end he's got no army left. Right. And so I think Theda was suggesting that in a big and diverse country, not clear, right, that you can do the kind of march that Trump and his loyalists are on right now. And then, of course, there's this question like, what happens after Trump? What happens to this coalition? And I think that's a really important question to raise. So concluding, and then we can talk. I think the range of possible outcomes here is very, very wide. Like, I think anybody who thinks that they know where this is going to go is has a lot more confidence in their views than I have in mine. I think people who study American politics really need to wake up if they're not thinking about this stuff. I just think we need to adjust to the critical components of this political world, not the political world that existed 25 years ago. And even then, I think their version of that, the version that many people had of that world was kind of imagined, but it's really imagined now. So we need to think about how executive power operates when there's very limited horizontal accountability and maybe not all that much vertical accountability. We need to think about a new political economy and the kind of political economy that I was very quickly trying to say something about. And I'll just say one thing in closing here. So like one example, we can talk about a lot of different elite institutions and how these kinds of things play out across different elite institutions. It's interesting to me that I think the top law firms actually turned out to be more vulnerable than universities. Right? Not that universities aren't vulnerable, we are, right? But it's interesting to think about like how fragile are these institutions, how vulnerable are they to this kind of expectations game and tipping point and stuff like that. The media is obviously critical here. People who study comparative democratic backsliding know how important the media is here. And also I'll just say like maybe the last example pulling from the American politics literature and thinking about where we are and where we need to go. The American politics literature spends a lot of time thinking about like, can I measure media effects? Like, can I measure, if I poke you with this ad, what does it do to you? If I lock you in a room and make you watch this show, what does it do to you? We need a political economy of the media, right? We need to know, because these are like big corporations, and a lot of times the media piece is just a little piece within a bigger thing, right? Jeff Bezos cares about a lot of things besides the Washington Post. Cares about a lot of things more than he cares about the Washington Post, right? And a lot of these big conglomerates, they care about a lot of things more than they care about how they do the news. So we need to think, we don't really have a political economy in the media, at least I don't see a literature of political science about that. Maybe it's elsewhere. But that's the kind of thing we need to be doing if we're going to try to understand the world we're actually living in. Stop there and take questions.
Do you want to set the table?
Yeah, I would love that.
We don't have a lot of time for like reflections, long-winded comments. Please keep your questions brief. Why don't we start with you, Didi? I'm keeping a list.
Thanks, Paul. This was great. It's not very depressing. So first question is just picking up on one thing that you said, that donors switch sides. We actually have descriptive evidence of that. And the second is just about ideology. There's so many Americans who think ideology kind of doesn't matter. Only the Republicans have a targeted ideology. But this new ideology, by whatever crypto fascists we want to call them, like this Musk and Pierson thing, is new and is very underbaked, but is nihilistic. It's just about destruction. It has nothing to do with the kind of Paul Ryan whateverism there was in 2012. So what is the relationship of this?
Yeah, so I don't know the answer to the first question, but it's a great one. Hoping Adam is working on stuff like that. There's clearly we know like some prominent people who switch sides, but the extent to which it's, there are other possibilities that might account for that, right? for that kind of outcome. Ideology. So one thing about like having the wealthy as a category, right, is like we might need to actually try to study the ideology of like 20 people.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Like it doesn't have like we usually think of like ideology as something that's like a mass phenomenon, right? But I think we do need to try to understand, reading Isaacson's Musk biography now, because which I put off doing for a long time, but I didn't want to do it. But now I feel like I need to try to understand better how this person thinks and where he comes from. We do, it's tricky when you're talking about small numbers of individuals, what they say, how that relates to what they really think, right, and what is really motivating them, that's unclear. But that is, you do see. I shouldn't go on too much. I do think it's really interesting to think a little bit about the extent to which within these very wealthy segments of the population, there was a backlash to Bidenomics, and in particular to the kind of antitrust efforts of Bidenomics. It's certainly something that they say, right, was important to them, that there's kind of alienation from the Democratic Party that's driving this.
Catherine?
Sure. Hi, Paul. I'm
Hey.
sorry I came in late. I'm Catherine Stoner.
Yeah.
I was in graduate school when you were at Harvard. by the way.
Yeah.
So since you invoked Russia twice.
Catherine is our director. She bought lunch today.
No, it's fine. We all bought it. And paid for your trip from Berkeley.
Thank you.
So since you invoked Russia twice, and I was just thinking about, and that's what I work on. So is this a oligarchy, or, is it similar or dissimilar? So, Russia was we thought more of an oligarchy before the war, right? And it's just, I think the big difference, but maybe we're heading this way, which is my question, is that, Putin currently controls the distribution of assets and who gets to keep their property. That's partly a negative externality from the state. So are we heading in that direction, do you think, in the US? And I'll just, Harvard, you've invoked universities too. I don't know if you know that they just revoked Harvard's ability to take foreign students.
Yeah.
You probably.
Yeah, I did. Somebody told me that when I was walking in the door.
Including existing foreign students cannot enroll.
Yeah. So try to be concise. I did not see this piece of what's happening coming. I feel like I saw a bunch of stuff coming, but I didn't see this, didn't see the Doge piece of this coming. The ability, I don't think, and again, Americanists would not have thought about this. We always think we've got a weak state, it's really decentralized, and there are lots of checks and balances. So the idea that you could gain control over critical elements of the state, right, and weaponize them because you've got loyalists and because nobody's going to stop you, right? I don't think very many people saw that coming, and I think it's extremely powerful and clearly shifts the balance of power, right, between these super wealthy donors. One of the things that's really interesting that's going on is if you had asked me to kind of map out power in the Republican network 5 years ago, I would have said a lot of things that really don't seem very true now, right? And so one would be the Koch brothers, would be one. But again, even I really question even how powerful people like Bezos and Zuckerberg are in this, and they obviously have certain kinds of power. The other would be a few years ago, I would have said boy, that Republican majority on the Supreme Court, super powerful, more powerful than any court we've had in 100 years, right? Super policymaker, right? I'm much less convinced of that now, right? So it is fascinating to see how quickly, and again, it's uncertain where we're going, but how quickly it leads to a scenario under which you could imagine all of that authority of the administrative state being in the hands of a small team, right, led by Trump and a core of loyalists who can use it to reward and punish.
And that's what Putin does.
Yeah.
Jim Goldgeier?
Oh, great, thanks. Yeah, Jim Goldgeier, research affiliate here. I want to ask you a question about the link between the horizontal and vertical accountability and the inequality that you mentioned, because the Trump policies, Republican policies, are going to increase inequality, cuts to healthcare, tariffs. So does that, at some point, does that affect the vertical accountability? I keep waiting for members of Congress to care what happens to their constituents.
You just summarized in a lot of ways the research that Jacob and I have been trying to do over the last 20 plus years, right? Really starting with W. Bush's tax cuts in 2001, which were how could this is so far from what people say that they actually want, right? If you actually ask them, what would you like to do with this budget surplus? We had a budget surplus now. What would you? It's so far from what how can you do that? Define the rules. What I think American politics scholars thought, you got to go with the median voter, right? And so we've spent sort of 20 years chasing that. And so I think it's still a very topical question. And I wouldn't say that I think doing super unpopular things, helps a politician. But I'm way past believing that we should expect any kind of automatic correction based on that. And there is a kind of, just quickly mention, a guy named Michael Shepard, who's got a book coming out. He's a political scientist. He's in the public health department at Michigan. Has a book coming out on what I will call, he doesn't say this, kind of the MAGA healthcare doom loop, right? Which is focused particularly on rural America and the South, where the right gains power, pursues a bunch of health policies that are really bad for healthcare outcomes, right? Elizabeth, a bunch of work is relevant to this. And then people just, but rather than that producing some kind of corrective coming from the voters vote more MAGA as that happens. Like they're really mad. They think government is terrible, right? They're often in really homogeneous informational environments. And I think that's like the informational environment is a big aspect of this too.
Hakeem Jefferson?
Well, this was great. Thank you so much. And it didn't feel like a repeat of having read the book so far. So I wanted to ask you a question about, just to get a sense of how you're thinking about the social politics of these ultra wealthy folks that you put on the screen. So I'm thinking about Zuck and masculinity, or Musk and kind of white identity politics and racism, and a broader sense among this class of rich elites that there's a kind of social politics that's increasingly ever present. And just wanted to hear your thinking about whether you think that's sort of incidental to their bottom line concerns, or how you're thinking it's working in play with the broader set of concerns they have.
It's a great question. And people should study it. I can say a bunch of anecdotal stuff. I mean,
I love it.
One thing that I just find shocking, as I read about all this, it's like, these are like the wealthiest people, like we've never generated people who are so wealthy. Like, why are they so mad? Like, why do they feel so picked upon? It's just at that psychological level. And so reading the Musk biography, I'll just say this is his motor. Like he is all like tearing things apart, and just going into places and just he does a lot of other things too, but he's super, this energizes him. That is, I think, an important part of what's going on with him. And, of course, one of the weird things is again, you're talking about a pretty small number of people, and you almost have to get we can study aggregates, right? But it's we need a team of therapists to take each of these people individually. So obviously with Musk, the white nationalism stuff is not very buried. The more you learn about him, the more you see that in his background, his father and grandfather. But I don't have any general conclusions for you.
Okay, I'm next on the queue, but Frank, you're getting my question. Go for it. No, please.
So on this political economy of media, I wrote a blog post a little while ago about, it was entitled Elon Musk and the Collapse of Western Civilization. The basic idea,
Just a little blog.
It started earlier than that with Berlusconi, who I think set up a new pattern where you're a rich person, you buy a media empire, you use the media empire to gain political power, and then you exercise political power to protect your empire. Now, rich people have always tried to buy good policies, but I do think that this is a kind of new pattern that,
I agree.
And then Musk has emulated it perfectly. So, it's just one way to think.
Yeah, no, well, I look forward to reading that cheerful piece. What do I know about this and talking in this room? But it does feel a little bit like Musk stumbled into Twitter, right? I think once he had it.
Clearly, I think he intended this all along. That's why he was willing to take a loss on Twitter because he wasn't interested.
Well, but he tried to get out of it. anyway, I mean, I don't feel like I'm knowledgeable enough to really, but I think I would just caution about, and I'll read the piece about the extent to which this is all thought out, but if it is clearly a very, very powerful platform, right, that he has weaponized, right? And more broadly, I think we would need to talk about this, there's just this world of like the disengaged the politically disengaged out there, and they have shifted dramatically in the direction of Republicans and MAGA, right? And there used to be this idea that like disengaged voters, low information voters, Democrats actually wanted those people in the electorate. They would do better if those people were in the electorate. And that is not true anymore. But that is really, really not true. And so thinking about, I think we do need to try to understand these broader media environments and who is shaping them and how that relates to political action.
All right, so since we have less than 15 minutes left, with your permission, I'll pair questions.
That's great.
Okay, and we're also gonna do something else. This is a new innovation. Everybody gets 35 seconds to pose their questions. So we'll start with you, Maria.
Great, Maria Criel and Larry. So this is around your observation of these ultra wealthy bending the knee, and I buy that, but that brings up something puzzling to me, which is ultra wealthy are wealthier than ever, and their access to politics is, as easy as it gets. So why don't they buy a leader they can control? Was it a miscalculation? Did they not expect this weaponization? Or was it like the best of two bad choices?
That's great. Oh, you want to get to?
Oh, yes. Kumi.
Thank you, Paul. What's your worst case scenario? So because what you see being played out here is authoritarian playbook. And if I were to give you my one bullet points worst case scenario, he's got a semi-constitutional crisis already by not following court decisions. Some people say it's a constitutional crisis, but let's call it a semi-constitutional crisis. On the other hand, after this budget bill passes through, when social security cuts and so on start happening, then the resistance that is rising is going to rise more. My sense is that they will then insert agent provocateurs into those.
I need to wrap it up. Sorry,
Yeah.
35 seconds.
And that, in fact, is moving towards evoking the Insurrection Act. I would even say that the midterm elections are not guaranteed. Am I being too cautious in my concerns?
So I love this question. Why did they buy somebody more reliable? And there is a really good literature in American politics on this idea that the parties are, at least in part, coalitions of intense policy demanders. And what they're looking for is somebody who they think is electable and somebody who they think is going to be reliable, right? And so there's an invisible primary in which that kind of stuff plays out. And there was a lot of resistance to Trump among the wealthy. The Koch network is very resistant to him. I think a lot of people were resistant from him. I don't think he did not get like the big money donations in 2016, right? And in part because people rightly thought he was incredibly unreliable. So again, but again, I think that raises the issue now, like which way does the influence run? Right. And so I didn't convey it as clearly as I might have, but I think it would be easy for me, like superficially drawing some of the data that I showed you, to tell a kind of, oh, this is like plutocratic populism all over 1.0 all over again, right? And in some ways it is like a lot of the wealthy are going to benefit a lot from a lot of his policies, right? But I just don't think that they're in control now, and I don't think they were in a position where they could like. I mean, we could go into like how did Trump get the 2024 nomination? Like astonishing thing, right? That this guy who led a coup, right, instigated a coup, used that language, instigated a coup, right, is then renominated, right, by his party. So but it wasn't like the elites picked them, right? I don't think that's how it works. So again, I see the balance of power is shifting very, very much in his direction. Worst case scenario. I mean, so like I said, I think the range of outcomes is very, very wide, wider maybe than some people recognize. I think there are, I look at the bond rates every day, and I look at the public approval ratings every day. I think those matter. I think as he becomes more unpopular with different audiences, that is consequential and could potentially weaken their position. Though not necessarily, right? Because I think there's a danger that you start to see popularity leads to unrest, right? And unrest leads to a more autocratic kind of reaction. I think that's quite plausible. The other thing I would say is that I think things are moving quite quickly. I talked with Steve Levitsky the other day, and he said he was kind of shocked by how quickly some of this stuff was happening, how some of the shifts in elite institutions were happening. But I think one thing that we need to pay attention to, Anna Guzman-Labus is here, she could think about this, about sort of the temporality of all this, that there are things that are kind of moving at different paces, right? And so we see the DOGE stuff right away, but some stuff that I think could be quite consequential we haven't really seen yet, like what's going to happen with the FBI or what's going to happen with the Department of Justice, right? I mean, he has loyalists, running those operations, and I'm sure they have big plans, right? And we haven't seen that kind of stuff yet, and of course it could be very consequential and raise all sorts of issues about democratic backsliding that we haven't seen yet.
Alex, 35 seconds.
Okay, two quick questions. One, how do you see the attacks on universities fitting into your broader conceptual framework of accountability? And second, I think it's been interesting in tariffs that you have seen this sort of sectional backlash from specific corporations or industries like the automobiles, which led him to sort of retrench certain aspects. And I wonder whether you see that as a sign that there could be a strong coordinated response, or if it's going to be inherently sort of piecemeal, reactionary, sectional.
That's good. Two questions. Oh, yeah, you're gonna. Okay.
I'm Matt from the business school, and I want to pick up on the issue of information and facts of the media and political economy of media. So a lot of the way it will play out. So I want to endorse your call at the very end to study political economy of the media. We see the Comcast thing, 60 Minutes, CBS, and things of that sort. But I just want to go back historically to issues around propaganda in the US, particularly anti-government propaganda. So this big myth idea that hate the government, and the attitudes that we see today about those, in other words, is government bad?
Only Hashem can get away with that. You're so good at it. You're so good at it.
Sorry, I learned this in Guantanamo.
I think I've been doing this. Setting people. I said, "Let's little bell, it just tinkles a little bit."
No, that's not gonna fit this round.
With this round. Good enough. Okay. Great questions. The attack on universities. I think the way to think about this is that there is an attack going on basically all sides of autonomous civil society, right? Yeah. There is one thing going on, and it plays out in different ways in different environments, and of course, lots of reasons why they hate universities in particular, including partisan. Universities have become a democratic, capital D democratic space, right? It's Democratic Party space. And so, but I think there are attacks on all of these institutional settings and I actually think the more that people see this as one thing, right? The more the elites of these institutions see it as one thing and don't take the attitude of I need to put my head down, right? So they go after somebody else. They're going to go after everybody that. I just think that's really clear. And it's not I don't think Harvard. Frankly, I spent a long time in Harvard. I don't frankly think Harvard was born a more heroic institution than Columbia. I think they saw what happened to Columbia, and I think they got that particularly egregious letter, which has left them very little choice. But I think the more that people see this is a big fight across all of these domains, and the more that people recognize that eventually it's coming for all autonomous sites. civil society, the more likely resistance is to succeed. The tariff thing, I think the tariff stuff is a big deal. Obviously, I think it's a huge mistake from the point, if you're thinking about a project of democratic backsliding, I think this is a big blunder for that. I don't think that Trump is that, that's carefully strategic. Some other would-be autocrat, would think about this differently. But I don't think it's that easy to put the genie back in the bottle, right? Say like, okay, well, I'm not going to raise tariffs this month. But I don't think that actually gets them out of the problem that they have. So I would add that to the pile of things that potentially generate unpopularity. And now I'm losing the thread of what to say about your question about anti-state problem. Yeah. The U.S. and this again, I think this is a big part of this this book I mentioned by the guy at Michigan, Michael Shepard. We live in an anti-government country, a country that's always had kind of strong anti-statist, anti-government attitudes. And that has been a big project of the Republican Party over the last 50 years. And it's also playing out in what is a very anti-institutional moment in global culture, I would say, the culture of the developed world. And that's a big resource for right-wing populism. Right? They can play that card. So like the Doge thing, there's so much about Doge, and we shouldn't get it. Doge is not popular. Like what they're doing overall, not popular, right? But a framing that says like government's really incompetent, we need to weed a lot of this stuff out. That framing alone is popular.
Question, Ali?
Okay. Thank you very much for this presentation. I'm all for your argument about making American politics closer to comparative. But wouldn't you agree that your emphasis on the big business or a handful of businessmen actually pushes the argument back towards American exceptionalism? Isn't there anything more generalizable and appealing to the larger comparative politics literature?
And if we may tag one more, my friend in the back.
Hi, my name is Richard. I'm a lecturer in the college program here. It's a first-year requirement for first-year students. So in relation to the ideology of the I-20, for researchers who are interested, Mark Andreessen did an episode with wrestler guy, Joe Rogan, and there could be some insightful clues in relationship to how this sort of like the elite ideology of the 20 gained some traction with, as it were, sort of already existing presuppositions in American culture. But the question that I had was, let's say Trump pulls a Carl Schmitt. Has anyone done any research in relation to active duty, enlisted, and also service members, just to get a sense of like how they gauge what it means to support the Constitution?
So just on that last, not that I know of. I don't know that. And again, I just don't think, like back in the 1950s, like political scientists studied the American military. Like that was the thing that people tried to understand, and its place in our polity. And I just, there may be there's probably some public opinion work, maybe came about on people in the military, but I just don't think they're just the way that they're, civil military relations as like a subject matter, which would be very significant in comparative politics, just does not exist in America. And there doesn't seem to be any urgency, as far as I can tell, in getting there. Right, which leads to your question. So, because I agree, I think the U.S. is exceptional in a lot of ways, right? But I think I really agree with that, and I actually think I was trying to stress some of the ways in which the U.S. is exceptional. We're exceptional in having having a strong two-party system. We're exceptional in the degree of this kind of top end inequality, right? Those are big differences from most other cases. Where I was, the plea for comparative for me was just saying, like, people who study American politics don't know how to study the United States, right? And would learn a lot about what's actually interesting about the United States, right? And how to understand it by engaging with people who study other countries and see similarities and differences, right? Even across systems that might look very different. So another chat, I'm not intentionally pandering to Stanford audiences, but Jonathan Rodin's book, Why Cities Lose, right, is, I think, just a really great example of a book that is largely about the United States, right? But builds a really different understanding of what's going on in American politics by situating the United States comparatively, right? And thinking about what it means to have a strong two-party system where representation is based on particular geographic units and the effect that can have on your politics. And most people are studying American politics because they know nothing about other countries and don't think they need to know anything about other countries. They just take these things for granted.
We found.
Right. And they don't think, I know you guys, again, I'm pandering.
We're aware.
I'm pandering.
Well, I wanted to point out Didi quote too, who did the comparativist too,
Yes.
on the US.
Yeah. No, I am pandering.
Paul, you enriched us and depressed us with your research, but you honored us with this visit. Thank you so much for stopping by.